For 3 years, the West tried to freeze China out of AI, export controls on chips, export controls on models, an explicit bet that if you choke the supply, you choke the progress. It didn't work. Not only did it not work, it accidentally built the very thing it was trying to prevent. Chinese open-weight models now power the majority of open model token traffic on the biggest routing platform we can measure. Not someday, right now. And Beijing has noticed. The models won. And there is exactly one thing that tells you which way this goes. It hasn't happened yet. You have to understand what open weight actually meant for these labs, because it wasn't philosophy, it was forced. DeepSeek, Alibaba's Qwen, Zhipu's GLM, none of them could outspend OpenAI on marketing or distribution. They didn't have the brand, they didn't have the enterprise pipeline, and the export controls meant they didn't have the hardware to run their own models at global scale. So they did the one thing the Americans couldn't easily compete with. They gave the models away. Full weights, permissive, borderless licenses. Download, modify, run on your own hardware. No API key, no usage cap, no phone home telemetry. This was not charity, it was market entry. Every download was a user. Every user was a developer. Every developer was a distribution channel they didn't have to pay for. And it worked so well that the thing the West was supposed to dominate, controlling the platform everyone builds on, quietly shifted hemispheres. Let me show you how far this actually went. OpenRouter is a routing service. It sits between users and models. You type a prompt, it sends it to whichever model you pick. It is not the whole market, but it is the closest thing we have to a real-time ledger of which models people actually choose when all the options are on the table. In late 2024, Chinese open-weight models accounted for less than 2% of all tokens passing through OpenRouter. By mid-2026, around 61%. Not a trend, a takeover. You do not dominate a platform this completely without someone in the capital looking at the same numbers and asking what happens if they stop. On July 7, 2026, Reuters broke a story that should have been a much bigger deal than it was. China's Ministry of Commerce, the agency that oversees trade and technology exports, had held a series of meetings with the country's largest AI labs, Alibaba, ByteDance, Z, AI, which builds the GLM series. The topic on the table, restricting overseas access to China's most advanced AI models. Not just the unreleased ones, the open-weight ones, the ones already on Hugging Face. Now, read that carefully. This was not a policy announcement. No regulation was passed, no law was written. It was a deliberation, a government asking its own industry essentially. We let these models go. Should we stop? According to Reuters, the proposals being discussed include a licensing system for lower-end models, restrictions on which investors can fund domestic AI startups, and, this is the one that rewrites the stakes, reclassifying the unauthorized disclosure of proprietary AI technology as an offense under China's national security law. That is not don't copy our homework. That is unreleased model weights treated as protected state assets, same legal category as defense technology. The country that gave its weights away is now proposing to make leaking them a national security crime. Not because the open models failed, because they worked. Let me unpack what that actually means, because the national security framing is not cosmetic. When you classify something as a state asset, you're not just making it harder to copy, you're changing who gets to decide whether it leaves the country at all. What Reuters is describing is a proposal to slot unreleased model weights into that same architecture. If it happens, the decision to open a model stops being a company's call. It becomes a government review. That is the mechanism. The investor restrictions point the same direction, limit who can fund this work, and you limit who can pressure a lab to stay open. The signal isn't we're shutting it down, it's we're building the legal machinery to shut it down if we choose to. And the machinery is the story, because once it exists, the choice to use it becomes a question of when, not whether. Now, here's what this is not. This is not a ban. No regulation has been enacted. No law has been drafted. Reuters cited 3 sources speaking on condition of anonymity. The existing open weight models are not going anywhere. DeepSeek's weights are still downloadable. Qwen's weights are still downloadable. Z.AI's GLM 5.2 still carries its borderless MIT license. The models that exist today will continue to exist. What is actually being debated, and the Reuters report is explicit about this, is whether future models, the next generation, the ones that haven't shipped yet, should be subject to export controls before they leave the country. 2 sources told Reuters the measures may apply only to future models, not existing ones, with no timeline set. This is preemptive architecture, not retroactive confiscation. If you hear someone say China is banning open source AI, they are either misreading the reporting or they are comfortable being wrong in a direction that gets clicks. Neither is acceptable on this channel. The facts are narrower and more interesting than the headline, and I just gave them to you. And this is the part most coverage missed entirely. 25 days before the Reuters story broke, the United States government applied export controls to Anthropic's two newest models, Fable 5 and Mythos 5. Released June 9th, restricted June 12th. The trigger was a report from Amazon researchers describing a jailbreak that got Fable 5 to identify software vulnerabilities and produce code demonstrating an exploit. The order barred access by any foreign national, inside or outside the US, including Anthropic's own foreign national employees. Anthropic couldn't verify nationality in real time, so it suspended access for everyone, globally. A nationality control collapsed into a worldwide outage. Anthropic publicly disputed the order the same day, arguing the jailbreak exposed no unique Mythos-level capability, and that applying this standard industry-wide would halt all frontier model deployment. They worked with the government to train an improved safety classifier targeting the reported behavior. Controls lifted June 30th. Fable 5 returned globally July 1st. Mythos 5 was restored to a limited set of US organizations on June 26th and is still not broadly available. This was not a fumble. It was a fight the government won on the merits and then released. The models came back, but they came back inside a permanent architecture of government review. That is what Beijing watched. Not a farce, a working demonstration. Both governments, staring at the same technology, weeks apart, reaching for the same lever. And the lever worked. Which means the only question worth asking now is whether Beijing pulls it. I told you at the top there was one thing that tells you which way this goes. Here it is. The actual test is not whether Beijing passes a law this year. It probably won't. The test is simpler. Jipu's next frontier model, whenever it ships. GLM 5.2 shipped in June under an MIT license, days before the US moved to lock down its own frontier models. The timing matters. The pitch was explicit. Borderless access, no restrictions, MIT license. If Jipu's next model ships the same way, weights open on day one, no geographic or usage restrictions, then the Reuters deliberation was exactly that, a deliberation that went nowhere. But if the next model ships with any kind of gate, a license, a delayed release, a geographic restriction, an export classification, then the deliberation became a decision, and the era of Chinese open-weight default is over. That is the signal. Not a law, not a press release, a repo. Whether the next model is open at launch is the entire ballgame. And that brings us to the thing this channel has been tracking since the first video. The thesis was simple. Export constraints on hardware forced Chinese labs to be more efficient, more creative, and more open, because openness was the cheapest distribution channel they had. The models were open because the labs needed them to be. That thesis held, but it contained the seed of its own expiration. Here's where the hardware story actually stands. DeepSeek V3 was trained on over 2,000 NVIDIA H800S. For V4's core training run, DeepSeek has not disclosed which chips were used. Huawei says its chips were used for part of V4 flash training, the lightweight variant. And a Huawei-led team with Shenzhen Research Institutes completed full parameter post-training of V4 Pro on roughly 1,000 to send 910C chips, every weight updated, not an adapter layer. Post-training is not pre-training. Training a frontier model from scratch on domestic silicon remains unproven. That's the heavier, costlier job. V4's own technical report lists the expert parallel scheme as verified on both NVIDIA GPUs and Huawei Ascend NPUs side by side. The wall is moving. Inference fell. Post-training just fell. Pre-training from scratch is the last thing standing. That's the pattern I think we're watching. They don't need distribution anymore. They have users. They don't need the West's platform. They are the platform. The argument for keeping models open was never ideological, it was practical, and the practical case just got weaker on both sides of the Pacific. None of this is settled. The Reuters report describes a deliberation, not a doctrine. The models are still downloadable, the repos are still public, but the direction of travel matters more than the destination. Because in 2023, the conversation was about whether Chinese labs could build anything competitive without Western hardware. In 2026, the conversation is about whether they'll let you download it. That is not a debate about technology. It's a debate about power. Who gets to build on whose platform, and who gets to say when the door closes. The models won the open source war. Now both sides are asking the same question. Was that actually a good thing? And nobody likes the answer they're finding.